You may not have heard of critical legal studies unless you've been to law school, and only then if you were in the small minority of law students who had some interest in the philosophy of law. That would be a very small minority. Most law students, like most medical students and other professionals, either just want to make money, change the world in socially acceptable ways, or seek the prestige of a professional degree. Well, you've certainly heard of critical race theory, of systemic discrimination, colonialism, the patriarchy. If that's the case, then that's a good start. Critical legal studies and critical race theory are their siblings of the same parents, materialism and progressivism. They emerge from the same polluted ideological source, modernity. Critical legal studies, or CLS, is the political ideology of CRT applied to law, to legal philosophy and the practice of law, instead of specifically to the question of racial or other forms of oppression, as they say. Critical legal studies takes its place, along with legal positivism and legal realism, as dominant legal philosophies of the modern era. Please see my previous videos on legal positivism and legal realism if you're interested in those topics. CLS, if legal positivism and legal realism were not bad enough, is, I regret to say, without question, one of the most toxic and destructive legal philosophies to hit the West. It has had an enormous impact on the legal profession, law schools, bar associations, the judiciary, and on the thinking of lawyers in the service of the state or in private practice. The impact of CLS has rarely been overt or direct. Lawyers, legal drafters preparing legislation, or judges crafting their reasons for judgment never declare themselves to be loyal adherents to CLS philosophy. Most have no idea what it is. Rather, the influence has been more insidious. CLS modes of thinking have been adopted wholesale into policy, laws, rules of practice, and without anyone saying so, CLS ways of understanding the law and the world appeared almost out of nowhere into the language of the law in judicial pronouncements and legislation, without fanfare. It has emerged like Venus from a scallop shell, fully formed, as obvious truth, not open to questioning or criticism. And what sane person would question obvious truth? CLS is a relatively new jurisprudential school that emerged in the United States in 1977, a very precise date. Some say it has Marxist origins, and certainly it does have many characteristics of Marxist thinking, but that is too simplistic. It also shares the attributes of radical, progressive, or as we say, woke ideology, suggesting that its roots can actually be traced to liberalism itself, and some of its core beliefs, such as equality theory, the sovereign individual, and belief in linear history, that history is progressing towards a utopian society, so long, of course, as those nasty fifth columnists are eliminated. CLS, I would argue, is simply the most radical edge of liberal theory, after absorbing some explicitly Marxist talking points. Marxism, of course, having failed miserably in its application in the 20th century. Arguably, CLS is the inevitable, final, authoritarian end place of radical, outcome-focused quality theory. It is worth starting out with a look at the Marxist theory of law, if there is such a thing. Marx never tried to answer the question, what is law? Or what should law be? Such questions didn't interest Marx. Rather, Marx concentrated his ire on how the law was being used within the wider socio-economic, historical, and political context. He used social and economic frameworks to determine the wider role of law so as to alert the so-called oppressed classes to the mystification of the real overall power structures. To Marx, law and religion were simply manifestations of historical class struggle. He set out to show the tools and tricks used by society's elites to maintain their power. For example, capitalism uses law to create the myth of law's neutrality in order to propagate a fake notion of justice. This trick was used to conceal the fact Law is simply an instrument of coercion used by those in economic power to exploit the masses. Marxist theory, much like radical progressivism or wokeism, isn't interested in a metaphysical explanation for law. Likewise, CLS lacks any convincing metaphysical foundation. A Marxist approach only provides a materialist explanation of law as the product of class society. It is fundamentally social. We can see the Marxist influence on wokeism or critical legal studies in the effort to expose the secret underlying agenda of law. That is a key word here, agenda. That things are not as they seem, and there are winners and losers, but the game is fixed. There is no higher morality. It's not that the worker lost his lawsuit against his employer because he made a promise, triggering the moral duty to keep your promises, but then broke the promise. All that is irrelevant. The law is a sham. If he lost his case, it is because of unequal bargaining power. The law of contract or property have no moral or traditional sources. It didn't emerge from human society and Western culture organically. It arose from social relations to maintain a power imbalance and control the means of production. Marxist legal theory is as primitive and brutal a materialist theory as Darwinism, and undoubtedly influenced by it, or vice versa. Replace a clashing of species with only the fittest surviving with a clash between soulless classes locked in a death struggle for power and control. Marxist theory is opposed to natural law theory in that the idea of law or right has nothing to do with God or reason. We don't have any connection to God, and our conscience is just there to play tricks on us. Marxist legal theory is opposed to legal positivism in rejecting the source of law as the notional sovereign or state. You can't just make law by taking control of the legislature and passing laws. Law is a social fact that materializes under particular historical circumstances. The ideological function of law is hidden. It masquerades as a neutral objective reality. Laws, such as the law of contract, operate using a false consciousness. Law pretends that justice is blind and the parties have equal bargaining power. In modern social democratic society, the law pretends imbalances in bargaining power can be corrected by the state with various legal remedies and tricks, like consumer protection legislation or trade union laws. This simply creates more layers of fake consciousness with the carrot of consumerism. Marxists argue the system always gives the capitalist, the manufacturer or employer, the upper hand. Given how many new trillionaires we have after COVID, this isn't an implausible perspective. The critical legal studies movement is said to have its roots at Harvard University, since most of the first CLSers were Harvard professors. The movement was given form by thinkers like Mark Tushnet, Duncan Kennedy, and Roberto Unger, all Harvard profs at one time or another. A few themes of CLS from the start is that law is really just about telling stories that need to be deconstructed, and that law is a set of political judgments, prejudices, and power relationships. But even one of the founders of CLS, Professor Tushnet, has written that CLS actually finds its origins in legal realism, which rejected legal formalism and saw law as judge-made. The law emerges not from legislation or past judicial decisions, stare decisis, but from the biases and prejudices and even feelings of individual judges. Morality is irrelevant. But another clue that CLS isn't just based on Marxist theory is to consider the timing of its emergence and why that might be. Why the late 1970s? Well, the 1960s, as we often hear, had seen the full emergence of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the war on poverty, and the full adoption of belief that technological progress, free love, and an ample supply of psychedelics was going to make the world a better place. You could say by the end of the 60s, the West was indeed more liberal, more equal. But why did things still seem to be getting worse? The movement seemed to stall in the 1970s. CLS can be seen as yet another example of the progressive response to failure. For one, you never admit that progressivism is a failed ideology and that there could be no question anymore that attempts to achieve perfect equality, perfect freedom, and happiness was impossible and in fact was leading to inhuman results and great unhappiness. Progressives could just admit that if you ignore the culture, traditions, and unspoken laws of a people and community, your project was not only going to fail, it was going to produce millions of broken families and lives. Progressives admit failure? Of course not. What the progressives did and still do to this day is double down. If progressivism has failed, we need more progressivism. We need to radicalize. CLS can be seen as just another example of that. CLS is just a visit to Studio 54 for intellectuals. If we listen to the founders of CLS, Professor Kennedy, for example, you are transported back to the worst university lecture you ever attended, listening to some elitist professor spouting more Marxist nonsense to a class of drooling wannabes, undoubtedly struggling, as you were, to understand what the hell the professor was talking about.
But the background idea is that what one ought to do as a critic of this kind is to analyze the way in which it is an ideological intelligentsia, which is reproducing a status quo, and do things that are designed to attack it or shake it. So I start from a classic Marxist antagonistic attitude, although, again, I don't believe in the labor theory of value, which is that this kind of a project is an antagonistic or aggressive project. So it's devoted to an attack, which is also in the interest of the victim, but not being a victim.
Again, you'll note CLS is not simply Marxist theory, as Professor Kennedy has acknowledged. For one, CLS has, in quotes, sidelined historical materialism as a viable framework for left-leaning legal thought, much to the disappointment of the Marxists. CLS is more of a slippery customer. As Professor Samuel Moyne has stated, the chief virtue of the more sophisticated versions of CLS is their recognition that legal development is neither wholly determined by extra-legal social, political, or economic factors, nor the wholly indeterminate product of linguistic ambiguity and rhetorical contestation. In other words, of all radical legal theories, CLS is uniquely capable of acknowledging functional and interpretive underdetermination, while not ignoring the degree to which legal outcomes tend to reproduce, rather than resist, or have no obvious relation to, the prevailing distributions of social, political, and economic power in a given society. It is this capacity to think indeterminacy and determinacy together and in balance that makes CLS such a promising methodological foundation on which to build a fuller social theory of law. Professor Moyne would acknowledge that CLS is always a work in progress and has never become a, in quotes, fully fleshed out social theory of law, close quotes. Like a quark, you can only ever know where it was. That is consistent with the fact CLS adherents are morally skeptical and do not believe, as some legal positivists do, that there can be a science of law. Before going further, it's important to note that CLS is extremely diffuse as a theory, with many offshoots and influences, all which require separate analysis. These include law and literature. You can see a video of mine commenting on an article in this area. There is also postmodern legal theory, critical race theory, of course, which I've mentioned, feminist legal theory, and law and semiotics. To this list, we could add post-human legal theory. I just made that up, which is arguably the dominant philosophical and political movement in the West today, with its roots in the climate crisis, the man is a virus crowd, and its de-emphasis of humanity and the human as the central player in reality. And also the IA revolution, which is infiltrating our societies without any serious opposition and seems to see human beings as superfluous. To be clear, I have no idea what post-human legal theory would look like, or whether it belongs in the CLS camp or not. Do post-humans need law? Do android lawyers dream of electric billable hours? I mean, once you dispose of humanity's central place in reality, presumably there isn't much place anymore for class struggle and power relations between people. CLS, as the clip from Professor Kennedy illustrates, continues to espouse a number of beliefs that are highly questionable in 2024. First, it sees itself as the most radical enemy of the liberal order rather than being a part of it. Second, it sees rights as being manipulated by the system against the progressive order rather than appreciating that the progressive woke order now seems very much in charge. Third, law reproduces the oppressive character of society with the imposition of the ideological preferences of one group of people over the community. Taylor Swift may still be yelling, "Down with the patriarchy," but that is a bit like Cato yelling, "Carthago delenda est," long after Carthage was at Rome's mercy. The CLSers' attempt to demystify the law has been directed at a number of areas: contract law, the market system-free competition policy, private property, legitimizing power, democracy, the regime of rights, formal equality, legal education, and of course, the doctrine of stare decisis. For example, CLSers share the Marxist trope that private property is simply a tool of the capitalists to hold the poor down, reject formal equality, which they say allows the courts to ignore vast disparities in economic, social, and political power, and that only revolutionary change, such as enforced equality of outcome, will work, and, probably correctly, see democracy as a sham in which only the few and the wealthy or well-connected have influence or can effectively participate in the system. Much as with legal realism, the CLS theory of law has two gaping blind spots. One is that it is almost exclusively descriptive. It can tell us how the law seems to operate, but has almost nothing to say about the distinction between the law in principle and the law in practice. It is hamstrung in being a purely materialistic system devoted to an ideology of heaven on earth, which it believes for some reason is attainable. But more glaring, it is hamstrung by its liberal assumptions. It assumes the Enlightenment project and industrial and technocratic revolutions were basically good things and are here to stay, with some tinkering required. And the mass of individuals in these societies have no culture, have no traditions, have no unwritten laws that need to be considered. People are interchangeable economic units, mere consumers with claims on resources and the fruits of their labor, other than certain designated victim or oppressed classes that are allowed for some reason to espouse what might be called traditional or ancestral rights, for reasons that certainly sound metaphysical, but the incoherence of which, in the grand scheme of things, is given scant attention. CLS is yet another modernist exercise, and the idea that modernism itself might be the problem, that people have customs and traditions, the absence of which causes disenchantment in mass society, is not something progressives or CLSers are capable or would be willing to contemplate. If there are inequalities in society, these problems can only be due to racial or economic or other forms of oppression. The problem must be systemic, a word that seems to come up when proof is absent. The great irony is that CLS, as a descriptive leftist enterprise, has failed to notice that the evil robber barons and patriarchs are no longer at the wheel. We live in a progressive age of woke capitalism, rainbows, mass censorship, cancel culture, mass homogenization and urbanization, and re-education of misfits. CLS set out to show that law was about politics and power and control. Whether true or not in 1977, it is certainly true, one could argue today, as the judiciary seems more and more at the disposal of the executive on political issues. Take a look at the UK at the moment. And laws are put in place at a feverish pace to impose progressive views of reality on the population and to silence dissent. It has been said that the message of Orwell's 1984 was supposed to be a warning, not an instruction manual. The same could be said of CLS, of critical legal studies. Its message, that the law is simply a tool to maintain the status quo and impose the regime agenda, seems very much like an instruction manual for our new progressive overlords with no relief in sight.